Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to tackle the steering on the Tamiya Bullhead. If you look closely at the front axle, you'll notice that I've already fitted a kit of bits. It seemed a bit daft to design and test fit all the parts just to remove them again, since we're going to have to do the rear axle anyway. As usual then, we need to remove the body and wheels, move the camera, and get started. Back in the olden days of plastic gear servos, you needed some really soft servo savers so they'd survive the big tyres getting bumped, especially considering one servo took all the bumps from all four wheels. These days we've got nice and affordable metal gear servos, so we can fit one per axle and not worry too much about servo savers. The goal of this servo mount was to get the servo and steering behind the stock bumper, and I very nearly managed it. The bumper was moved just 3mm forward, which you're never going to notice. To do this, there wasn't quite enough space for a standard size servo, so here we have a low profile one, a JX PDI 4409MG. It'll let us fit the servo slightly lower and further back than usual, so we can get it all in. It's not as torquey as a full-size servo, but it should be good enough. If we power the truck up, we can see a little teaser of the steering doing its thing. Right then, let's move to the rear and start taking things apart. We're going to start by removing the stock bumper so we can get at the servo saver. There's 4 screws with nuts to hold the bars on. We just need to loosen them a turn or so and off come the bars. Next to the mounts, which are held on with 4 self-tappers, remove them and we've got a nice bit of access to do the mods. Before we start adding stuff, we've still got to remove the servo saver, which is a bit of a pain. We need to undo the nut on the top, and we can't get a nut driver on it without dropping the axle down, so we're just going to have to use a spanner. It's going to take a while, but I reckon it's still quicker than unmounting the dampers to get more space. The bottom of the servo saver should drop straight out with the long screw. We move it free and pop the short linkage off the knuckle. Now we can remove the spring and the brass part from the top and jiggle the top of the servo saver out of its hole. On the bottom of the chassis we're going to need to remove the 3 screws that mount the servo. When we get the last one out, the servo is going to drop into the void, but not to worry, we'll fish it out from the top. The 4 screws that attach the electronics tray need to come out now, so we can tilt up the tray and remove the servo with its long linkage and servo saver remains. We won't be reusing this servo here, but it's still perfectly good, so it'll go in the parts bin ready for the next truck. While we're here, I'm going to feed through a servo extension as the wires on the low profile servos are a bit short to reach comfortably. We need to run the servo wire from the receiver and through the hole in the end of the chassis bottom to the axle. The tray can get its 4 screws put back in and we can move back where all the fun is, at the rear. At the front of the gearbox we need to remove the 2 screws and nuts, keeping the nuts handy for when we fit the new mount. And speaking of the mount, here we have the 3 parts. We have the servo mount, the bumper mount and the linkage protector. The servo mount sits on the side of the gearbox, just as a lot of fairly traditional clod axle mounted servo kits do. It fits with a pair of M3 countersunk screws with 2 washers on each one to space it off so it sits nicely. There's a few bits that stick up on the plastic gearbox, so without the washers the mount sits at a bit of an angle. The mount offers up with the screws going through the holes, threaded into the nuts that we set aside earlier. Nip them up and that's the mount fitted. The bumper mount next, which is just a block that sits to the side of the servo mount. It's fitted with 2 more countersunk screws. Now I should mention that with any luck I should have all the correct screw lengths on the Thingiverse page. None of them are all that critical though, as long as there's plenty of thread where it needs to be, it's all good. The linkage protector part screws in on the bottom of the bumper mount with a long M3 screw and attaches to the point where the stock bumper mounts with another M3 screw. A fairly simple set of bits that should make for a nice sturdy structure. The servo needs to go in now with the spline towards the bottom of the axle. It's a tight fit, so as we're fitting it we need to twist the suspension arm to give it enough space for the servo wire to fit around the mounting post. There's already a bit of a cutout on the post to make it easier, but I didn't want to remove too much material and weaken it. It's about as tight as you'd want to go. To attach the servo, we use 4 screws with washers. You could probably get away with just the 2, but 4 is going to be better. Now's a good time to sort out the linkage before we start adding more bits. I'm using one of the single-ended servo arms that comes with the servo. It's fairly chunky and sits tight against the servo. If you're going to go with another brand of servo, you might need to fiddle things around a bit. So we can connect up a ball end, I'm going to drill and tap the hole one in from the end. You can get away with going one further in, but if you think you might be fitting wheel wideners and going for a bit more steering, you're going to run a bit short on throw. From the inside face of the servo arm, we need to thread in an M3 screw with a washer. Now I did try and use the Tamiya ball end, but I just couldn't get enough clearance. So we've got a Traxxas end instead, which isn't really a bad thing, as at some point we'll probably end up swapping out the rest too. To attach the ball end, we just use an M3 plain nut. The linkage is made up from a length of M3 studding, or all thread, roughly 95mm long. I'll put the dimensions up on Thingiverse with all the rest of the info. Before we pop the servo arm on, we're going to need to make sure the servo's centered. Now we can power up the radio or just use a servo tester. Just make sure the trims are neutral and it should all be good. We want the arm to point straight up or as close as we can get it, then use an M3 screw to clamp it down. A quick test probably isn't a bad idea right now. The servo should go end to end without any colliding. There's actually a small relief or slot in the bumper mount, so the arm can go a bit beyond the spec just in case you really want to push the end points for a little bit extra steering. That just leaves clipping the other end of the linkage to the knuckles ball. Now when we change to Traxxas ends, we're going to need a little bit of a spacer to go in there, otherwise it should be nice and straightforward. Next up, we've got the other bumper mount that mounts to the gearbox, much like the stock bumper mount. The bottom screws in much like the stock part, with the linkage protector bit at the bottom. At the top, we screw in another screw into the gearbox through the metal brace. And it's also worth remembering that since the other side doesn't use the top mounting hole, we still need to fit a short screw to attach the brace. An M3x6 or 8 will do the job, or one of the short Tamiya self-tappers. Anyway, with all that done, we can power it up and see how it goes. Remember, the back end's already been done, so all we need to do back here is plug the servo into the extension and see what happens. I've already got the 4-wheel steering set up on the transmitter, so we can play with the different modes. I've not covered it here because every radio is going to be slightly different, and you might end up wanting to keep things simple and just use a standard Y lead. And there we go, working 4-wheel steering without all that squishiness you get from the stock setup. It should be a whole lot nicer to drive, or it will be when we can go out and actually try it. We still need to tuck the servo wire away neatly. Now I'm most likely going to go back and use some zip ties later just to make sure it stays nice and safe. To fit the bumper bars, we need to partially screw in 4 M3 screws with washers from the outside of the bumper mounts, leaving enough space for the tabs on the bars to fit. Then we offer up the bars and nip up the screws. I suppose we should pop the wheels back on now, and of course the body, and have a quick play. The difference is of course night and day. Admittedly we're on a smooth surface, so it's not a great demonstration, but even so you can see just how responsive it is. We've got all the steering modes working. We've got 4-wheel, crab, front wheel and rear wheel steering. We'll most likely only ever use the 4-wheel steering, but it's fun to have the others to play with too. And that's about it then. Link to the Thingiverse page will be in the description if you want to download a set of bits. So, as always, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!